My topic today is vaccine development. If I could have the first slide, yes. So I'm going to give an overview of the development of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine and how it got an emergency use authorization from the FDA. I will point out that this week, I think today, the FDA is considering publicly with their advisory committee, the Moderna vaccine, which is a similar mRNA vaccine. And so if it passes muster, then we may have 2 vaccines available, but of course these still will be in very short supply. I also want to say I got these slides from the Center for Biologics at FDA that regulates the vaccines. I'm not an expert in this area, but of course they're very busy today, so I'm happy to present, but these are their slides. Furthermore, I would like to say that, of course, the vaccine is to protect people and keep them from getting COVID-19. We do have 2 monoclonal antibodies available for treatment of the infected people and that are intended to keep them out of the hospital. I presented those data last week. We are trying to widen the circle and get delivery to nursing homes through the pharmacy groups and other home infusion and other ways. So nursing homes that are actually interested in receiving therapeutics and infusing patients to prevent hospitalization or progression of disease, that option is available for those who are already infected, because it will take some time for the vaccines to be able to be distributed and provide widespread protection. So let me go over the development plan in the EUA for Pfizer's vaccine. Next slide, please. So what is an emergency use authorization? Well, this EUA was for the Pfizer vaccine was granted December 11th, and it's for active immunization for prevention of COVID-19 in people 16 years of age and older. Next slide. So what is it? The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act says that when there's a declaration of a public health emergency by an appropriate authority, and that usually might be the Secretary of HHS, then emergency use authorizations can be granted. And these are for serious or life-threatening conditions where there's nothing else available. And the standard, though, is the product may be effective. And so this is true for the monoclonal antibodies. The vaccines, it's a little bit higher bar, obviously, since we're treating healthy individuals. And I'll go over the actual data. And the conclusion that the FDA has to arrive at is the known and potential benefits outweigh the known and potential risks. And this EUA can be then rescinded when a public health emergency is over, when other better products become available, or what have you. Next slide, please. So the Center for Biologics at FDA about the vaccines issued a guidance on the clinical trials for developing a vaccine that would be then eligible for an emergency use authorization. And because you really only have one shot often at demonstrating effectiveness, this would be the same data as the generated for the registration trial, in other words, for a full approval. They said that the primary efficacy endpoint estimate when you had a placebo-controlled trials should be at least 50% a point estimate for effectiveness, okay? And the lower bound should be greater than 30%. Of course, that isn't a large proportion of people vaccinated, protected. That's not what we usually see with a vaccine, but that was what they were willing to live with in this crisis. And that applies to the interim and final efficacy analysis. And they also required, though, a minimum of 2 months participant follow-up following final vaccination of the series. And that's because the type of immunologic adverse events we see with vaccines usually occur within the first 42 days or so after vaccination. Next slide. So what Pfizer did, it's a spike protein antigen, and they're multi-doses per vial. Now we've learned maybe there might be 6 doses per vial, which would be good news due to overfill. It's a 30 microgram dose given on day 1 and then day 22. Now, the good news about these mRNA vaccines, because they don't have a virus vector carrying them, you can use them over and over again. They can be boosted, or you can put in other mRNAs, because you don't develop immunity because there's no vector. In the early development of this, B and T cell responses were observed, and that's really good news. And they started this development in January and went through November. They did animal studies that were positive, and they didn't see evidence of enhanced disease in the animal models, which is something people are really worried about often with vaccines for respiratory illnesses. Next slide. So what they saw is people get a lot of, it's kind of what is called reactogenic. They get a lot of fever and chills and so forth. Good news for the nursing homes, its reactions are lower in older adults. Of course, this means the vaccine is working and you're getting an immune response to the proteins, but people, of course, don't like having this sort of flu-like symptoms after vaccination. But they saw excellent antibody responses. They then enrolled 44,000 individuals with 40% age 56 or older, and they had a Black and Latinx representation in these trials. And again, they saw the fatigue, headaches, chills pretty frequently as reactions. Next one. So what are the results? They had 170 cases who apparently hadn't been infected before they got vaccinated. They had 8 in the vaccinated arm and 162 in the placebo arm. So the probability they got the lower bound of 30% is overwhelming. They saw, in looking at severe cases, there was 1 in a vaccinated person versus 9 in placebo. So still, this isn't a large number of cases, but fortunately, we were really lucky. The efficacy of this vaccine is tremendously high. Now they're going to cross over their placebo patients. They will keep monitoring to see if any people get asymptomatic cases, which is another thing we wonder, could the vaccine cause people to be asymptomatic spreaders? They have safety monitoring plans in place, and they will try to get, right now this requires an extreme cold chain. As you may have heard, they are developing a room temperature stable formulation, they hope. Next slide, but they need to get this out as soon as possible, obviously. Now the FDA also looked at this. They pointed out that 25% were age 65 or older. About 45% of vaccinees had medical comorbidities. Again, the efficacy was very high, as well as efficacy for preventing severe cases. And after the first dose, interestingly, about half of the cases were diminished. So there is protection after the first dose, but before the second dose. And again, we saw all these safety problems, and FDA pointed out they saw a few cases out of the 22,000 people. They had 4 cases of Bell's palsy. And they've concluded that efficacy data and safety follow-up met the FDA's criteria that was in the guidance, and actually well exceeded it. Next slide. Further issues, there weren't any signals related to allergic reactions in the database, but we know as we expose many, many more people with mass vaccination campaign, we're starting to see anaphylactoid reactions in people. They have been reported in the UK and in the United States. And of course, this is an issue. They seem manageable so far. There's not much worry about incorporation into the genome. People have asked, what about 1 dose? Well, that, as we said, only provides maybe 50% protection. 2 doses are really get the protection way up. And we will, the agency will be watching, as well as Pfizer, and of course the CDC, watching for the incidence of anaphylactoid reactions. Next slide. The distribution, as you well know, is going to be adjusted as the volume expands. Right now it's for healthcare workers, pharmacy support for facilities that opt in, and Operation Warp Speed is actually assisting with the coordination and with distribution. Next slide. So when the Vaccine Advisory Committee, similar to the one that is meeting at this time for Moderna, the Vaccine Advisory Committee voted 17 yes, 4 no, 1 abstained. Most of the no votes related to keep the EUA to those 18 years of age and older out of concern there wasn't enough study in the younger people. I don't think that impacts the nursing home population significantly at this point. And I think that might be, is there another slide? Or that might be my last slide. Yeah, so I'm happy to open the floor for questions.